Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, you're very welcome to this week's episode of the Signpost webinar series. My name is Cian Condon, I'm an outreach and innovation specialist with Teagasc, and this morning we'll be looking into the MultiMilk project and the impact of multi-species swards and clover on dairy systems. I'm joined this morning by Brendan Horan, and Brendan is a research officer into grassland systems based in Moorpark, and also by Oisin Coakley, and Oisin is a Catchment Coordinator for the Lee and Bandon as well. Brendan, whenever you're ready, you can move ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Cian. Good morning, everyone. The title of the project is The Impact of Sward Species Diversity on Pasture and Animal Performance within Grazing Dairy Systems. This is a project that was conceived during COVID. So we're in our 6th year of this project now. I need to mention that there are a huge number of people who've been working on this project, in particular the PhD students who have completed their studies in this area, and also a lot of colleagues across Teagasc who have contributed lots to the project over time. Briefly, I guess, by way of introduction to the project, it's a farm systems project. So we've had these swards in place since 2021, and we've been looking at their impacts. But I guess to put it in context, I think, the challenges that we face in terms of a grazing livestock sector and for the dairy sector certainly are to continue to try and improve pasture productivity, the yield of pasture, the quality of pasture, and in some cases to adapt to climate change. So the drier free draining side certainly, and where this site is based, we certainly have been suffering more from dry summers and so on. So that's quite a challenge. We know also we have to reduce inputs and costs. So in terms of fertilizer, feed inputs, and costs have exploded on farms. So minimizing the use of inputs to maintain cost control and profitability on family farms is a huge objective. And we also know we have to reduce impacts. So whether it's in terms of nutrient losses, greenhouse gas emissions, or ammonia, look, we're well on our way to our 2030 sector targets. It looks like we will fall short of those targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, while the EPA also tell us that our surface water quality is still well below what's needed. So it's a big challenge to try and reduce those impacts in terms of agriculture's component, and I suppose to build then the other aspects of systems that we now want in terms of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and so on. So that's largely the context. I think it's important to say that, look, there's nothing more fundamental than the sward you have in terms of trying to meet some of these targets. And I think when you look at the science that's available, like pasture-based systems are very adaptable, and we can meet many of these targets at the same time and make improvements across all of these challenges through the systems of pasture that we have in Ireland. So that's a real opportunity for us. I want to just say in terms of, I suppose, before we get into the study, that as a scientist, you couldn't but be really impressed with the body of evidence coming from, not just from Ireland, but from overseas, showing benefits from increasing sward diversity. So including the clovers and including more recently, probably the herbs in our swards. The benefits of that are showing themselves in terms of increasing the yield and yield stability in dry summers and so on. We've lots of evidence of that now in Ireland and overseas. Huge environmental benefits in terms of, obviously, with clovers, reducing nitrogen, chemical fertilizer nitrogen requirements, with plants like plantain, reducing nitrate leaching from these grazing swards and nitrous oxide emissions, building in more carbon into our soils and building biodiversity. So there's the weight of evidence for the benefits of increasing sward diversity are huge in terms of the research evidence. And at the same time, for family farms, all of the evidence we have also shows improvements in animal performance, animal intake, and so on. So it's a win-win in terms of farms, in terms of, I guess, what these types of systems and swards can do for us. I guess the only challenge is, though, that a lot of the evidence that's there historically has been based on relatively short-term experiments. And, for farmers, they definitely want to see long-term studies looking at the long-term impacts of these system changes in terms of how their farms work. And that's one of the benefits of this type of study. We've been carrying it now for 6 years, and there's 2 further years to go in. So it's providing that long-term database of what these systems look like. In terms of treatments, we've established 3 different sward types on the study in 2021. Full reseeds of a 60-hectare platform, 56 hectares, 20 blocks of land divided into 3 different sward types. a traditional perennial ryegrass PRG only sward, which we have continued to fertilize with 250 kilos of chemical nitrogen fertilizer. That's up here on the left. So that's high PPI ryegrass, typical of what's on farms. We've also put in the perennial ryegrass white clover sward. We've done a lot of work on that now, and as part of the system, we've put in that sward, which is 75% perennial ryegrass and 25% white clover. That was our target there, and providing that with half the chemical nitrogen fertilizer that we were putting on the perennial ryegrass only sward. And our third system was a multi-species, an 8-species multi-species sward, again getting the lower chemical nitrogen application. So we have one high chemical nitrogen grass only system and 2 low chemical nitrogen application grass clover and multi-species system. In terms of probably that multi-species system, it's probably the lesser known in terms of what components are in that. In addition to the same ryegrasses and white clovers, it's also got Timothy and Metapescio, so 2 other grasses. It's got red clover and Alsik clover, and it's got chicory and plantain. So it's got 3 functional groups. It's got grasses, clovers, and herbs. The aim there was to get about 55% grass, about 30% clovers, and about 15% herbs into the sward, and to look at the impacts that might have across a whole range of measures over time. So we've had a lot of measures as part of the treatments, and just to say in terms of the management, it's very important how you manage these different systems and compare them. We took the approach of very common level of management. So, same rotation lengths, same post-grazing residual heights, same stocking rates, same levels of feed supplementation in terms of concentrates. The only really difference in terms of the management was that we were applying a lot more chemical nitrogen to our perennial ryegrass only swards, and lower levels, obviously, particularly during summer for our grass clover and our multi-species swards. And we every paddock, every grazing, every rotation across all of those years, we've measured pre-graze and herbage mass, the botanical composition. So how does that change in these swards with these different components, the nutritive value, the grazing efficiency, milk production, animal intake, and so on. So I'll just share some of the results then that we've observed over that first 5 years of the study and the publications that we have from this. So probably the first starting point is, well, what's the dry matter productivity of the sward and what is the quality of it? Because this would be a big concern that if you reduce chemical nitrogen use, you would reduce grass production or indeed the quality of pasture that you're providing to grazing animals. And in the first 3 years, we observed that on average, the perennial ryegrass only 250 treatment produced 13.3 tons of dry matter. In comparison, our grass clover system produced about 12.5, so slightly lower, and our multi-species sward was 13.2, so similar to the grass only treatment. So on the face of it, the overall dry matter production, not dramatically different for a halving of the chemical fertilizer application. Obviously, when we reduce that chemical nitrogen fertilizer application, we become more dependent on clover contents. And while we would have aimed to have 25% white clover in our grass clover treatment, we failed to get to that level. We were at 16% in both of these treatments. And you'll see also quite a large level of variability paddock to paddock in terms of clover contribution. So look, there's quite a variation in terms of the clover contents based on the same management, the same method of establishment and so on. And that is certainly, that's a frustration, I think, for farmers as well to see, that we're not getting a constant, and that's something to work on for the future to try and reduce that variation in terms of clover contents. Plantain, we aimed for 15, we got about 13% during those first 3 years. The plantain content is shown here in the kind of the salmon color. It's been pretty consistent over time, around that 10%. Even today, there's around 10% plantain in those swards. It does go up and down. It's not as stable, for example, as, obviously the ryegrass and perhaps even the clovers. But on average, over time, it has been pretty resilient. Chicory, on the other hand, starts at a very high level. So that's this column here. And it really declines quickly. And, once you get beyond 2 years, 18 months to 2 years, really, there's very little chicory left in that sward. So persistency of plants, big differences. The chicories and the red clovers not really surviving particularly well in these swards over more than 2 years. Plantain better, and the clover contents have been very steady, but below what we would have liked. So that's been really the botanical story from the study. Secondly, then, in terms of the pasture quality, I suppose, look, any concerns we had in terms of how different would these swards be in terms of chemical analysis through our lab? We've observed very little differences. So the ash content is the first one here, is higher for multi-species swards. So that's typical with where you've got more mineral in the herb fraction, so you'll get a slight increase in that. But no significant difference in sward crude protein content, which is obviously very important. Fiber content slightly lower in the multi-species sward, the neutral detergent fiber, no difference in acid detergent fiber. And overall, organic matter digestibility, you're talking, 1% difference between the sward. So very low levels. We can be very happy that we can have high quality pastures regardless of which treatment here, and with significant reduction in chemical nitrogen, which is really important. I suppose the big one then for farmers is in terms of animal performance, and what would be the impact of having these swards over time. So Alan Jezegal is the PhD who has looked at this work in particular, and he's published the milk production data over the first 3 years of the study. On average, during that first 3 years, he ended up using about 600 kilos of concentrate. We've had dry summers to contend with, and that has required extra concentrate feeding, but identical between the two treatments. On average, in terms of milk production, we saw an increase in milk production going from the grass-only swards to the grass clover swards and into the multi-species swards, with very little difference really in terms of protein content in the milk. Fat content to decline a little bit in the multi-species swards, and that's probably a consequence of less fiber digestion in the rumen and so on. That's been seen in other studies as well. But ultimately, in terms of fat and protein production, the overall product produced that farmers are paid for in these systems, we got an increase as we increased diversity from grass clover to multi-species. So that's really encouraging, and you can see that here in terms of the profile of milk production over the year by certainly the multi-species pastures, by having those extra plants in there and those contributing in terms of increasing animal intake and performance from early in the season. We got an increase in performance over the season, and that mirrors itself with what's shown now in other enterprises in beef and in sheep enterprises in Ireland and also overseas, in terms of animals with more diversity in this ward tend to support higher intake and performance. And we confirmed that when we looked at the animal intake function. So on average, during 2 years, we measured intake during summer, in particular, where we had the differences in sward contents, I suppose, are at the highest level. So this probably isn't relevant across the full year, but certainly during the summer season, when you've got more clovers and herbs in the sward, we observed during those 2 years that going from a grass-only treatment to a grass clover treatment to a multi-species treatment, animal intake increased. And in terms of energy intake, then correcting for the quality of the swards, again, significantly higher, and consequently, I suppose, producing that higher level of performance. Interestingly, in terms of milk solids production per UFL of intake, so when you correct for the intake, a big difference between the grass clover and the multi-species swards here, but they were certainly both better in terms of milk solids per UFL than the grass-only treatments. So look, there is differences in efficiency also between these different swards in terms of how animals use them for milk production. Moving on then, I suppose, to the newer challenges, Charles Dewan and Ben Lahart would have measured methane emissions on these swards and using the green feed system, which I've shown up here. And that was measured during these intake measurement periods, where we, particularly, I suppose, during July and into October. And they saw the same thing in terms of milk production during those periods. You were getting higher milk yields, you were getting significantly more milk solids and higher dry matter intake during those periods. But interestingly, in terms of methane production, so grams per day per cow, you saw that on average, the grass and the multi-species were very similar, even though they had a higher intake. The methane production per cow per day was very similar for the grass and the multi-species. Grass clover swards tended to be slightly higher. So that was a significant difference. In terms of methane production per kilo of milk solids, so we saw, a significant benefit to the multi-species swards, that the amount of methane required per kilo of milk solids was less with those swards. So the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of product was reduced. In terms of methane yield per kilo dry matter intake, once again, these animals are eating more, and by producing the same total methane, their methane yield per kilo of intake is less. So that's a really interesting result. And it shows, I guess, that we can, I suppose, by virtue of changes in our sward, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions impact of our systems while maintaining high levels of productivity. And again, that study showed the profile of methane production in early lactation being lower than it is later, very consistently with other studies that Ben and Charlie have undertaken. Added to that then, I suppose, one of the novel parts of this study was to look at nitrate leaching. So we imposed ceramic cups across about 18% of the platform. And over the last 3 years, we've been looking closely at the nitrate leaching under these soils with grass clover, and multi-species swards at about 1 meter depth during the drainage season. So the drainage season starts in October on this farm. So week 1 here is the first 2 weeks of October. Week 2 is the second 2 weeks. Week 3 is the first 2 weeks of November, and so on, right out until April the following year. So this is the period of year when rainfall exceeds evapotranspiration, and so you've got net water movement down through the soils. And we've measured nitrate leaching through that period with colleagues in Johnstown Castle to look at the impacts in the ceramic cups of having these different sward types. And on average, we're 2.5 years through that data. So it is preliminary at this stage. We're still collecting the final parts of that data even today. Perennial ryegrass on average 7 milligrams of nitrate per litre in our ceramic cups on average during that period, compared to 9 with the perennial ryegrass grass clover and 5.7 milligrams with the multi-species. So significant differences according to year, obviously significant effects of week as well. So it changes as the year progresses. In terms of where that's happening, the big differences we're seeing here is during the autumn. So in particular, during the autumn period where you're coming out of a dry summer, you've got probably mobilization of, mineralization of nitrogen in the soil as it's re-wetted in the autumn. We are seeing quite significant differences in terms of nitrate leaching during the back end of the year with these different sward types. And I suppose that's a really interesting outcome for us in terms of the opportunities. We're limited in terms of solutions to reduce nitrate leaching in these grazing swards. And this definitely offers us one opportunity that we might be able to, affect a change to significantly reduce nitrate leaching during autumn. Bringing it all together then in terms of economics, what we've done is we typically what we do is we collect the production data and we model that through a 40-hectare farm system using the Moore Park Dairy Systems model, putting in the milk production differences we've observed, the different costs that might be attributable to these different systems, and the impacts in terms of 40-hectare farm in terms of profit. In terms of doing that exercise, Alan has also published that. And again, that shows you in terms of, I guess, as you go from the grass only to grass clover to multi-species, you've got extra milk receipts, extra milk being produced, and that's obviously valuable. And that's using current costs and prices, important to state. And in terms of costs then, I guess, look, we've also tried to reflect the extra cost that might be required in these grass clover and multi-species systems. So in terms of bloat oil, if you've got clovers in there, in terms of perhaps even reseeding more frequently to maintain plants, we included that aspect of the study that maybe we need to shorten the reseeding interval from 10 years back towards maybe 7 years in order to maintain herb and clover contributions in swards and so on. The fertilizer reductions were obviously a big attraction to these grass clover and multi-species swards because you're reducing chemical fertilizer levels a bit, but you are using more P and K fertilizers as well. Obviously, we have to be mindful of silage production and so on. And, if we're not growing enough grass in these systems because we're reseeding more frequently or because we're not growing as much grass, then that involves an extra importation of silage. And that's costed into the system. So that's why that difference in silage import costs, that was reflecting the extra reseeding that was going on and the extra requirement for purchase feed. But nonetheless, I guess overall, when we model in all those extra receipts and costs, we found on average, not big differences in profitability between the systems. And I think that's probably the most important thing for farmers to see, that these are not massively more profitable or less profitable than the system that they have today. But they certainly are contributing in terms of the other attributes that we're looking for in terms of these systems, in terms of reducing our reliance on inputs and also reducing our impacts in terms of the systems we have on the environment. Some colleagues also looked at milk attributes, and I just wanted to include a slide or two here. Renata Kovaskova has looked at the differences between perennial ryegrass and multi-species swards in terms of fatty acids and lipids, and she found on average increased polyunsaturated fatty acids levels. Obviously, milk's a highly nutritious product. There is some, enhancements you can have when you have high clovers in the sward and high herb contents, but it's trumped by stage of lactation, that these plants are, they're at relatively low levels in spring, they're higher in summer and autumn. So the stage of lactation effect is big there as well. We also had Richard Page looked at sensory and taste, palate, and so on of products produced from these grasses and multi-species swards, and whether it was trained panels on the left or for untrained panels on the right, there was no difference in terms of the taste palette in terms of the different products produced. So no impacts for product quality to worry about. So I guess to bring it together, to summarize, I think, look, the first thing to say is that I think we have to adapt our grazing systems to try and improve productivity, to reduce the impacts of these challenges in terms of reduced fertilizer use, meeting the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and nutrient losses, building biodiversity. And I know we have to be brave and ambitious in terms of that. And nothing's more important in that aspect, I guess, than the sward you have and what you can do there. And like you do research like this and you wonder, well, do we recommend this to farmers? Is this something we can recommend to farmers in the future? And I think, the evidence base that's there now in terms of our swards and the international evidence is saying, yes, that having legume-based swards with herbs in them have demonstrated the potential in this study and elsewhere that we can maintain grass production and quality with less chemical fertilizers, that we can increase the intake and performance of animals and indeed improve aspects of milk character in these systems, that we can reduce the intensity of methane production and nitrate leaching in these systems, and, at the very least, maintain and even improve slightly the financial performance of these systems. So, look, from my point of view, that those are all benefits, and therefore, it's encouraging in terms of the development of those systems for the future. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that there are still challenges. By no means this is a perfect outcome. And I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of reducing the variability in both clover and herb contents between paddocks, between seasons, between years. And look, that's an element of that is plant breeding, and an element of that is the management of those swards once those plants are in. So that's going to be, I think, an important area to continue on, to provide more consistency in terms of those swards for farmers, to maintain and improve diversity of plants for the longer term. So again, there's management and breeding elements to that. And I think also then probably, look, you are adding extra components to swards, and it's important then that you're able to, when you're talking to individual farmers, that what's the best combination for your farm based on your soil type, your climate, and so on. So that's the nuance that's required then for the different types of farm systems, then to make the best recommendation for those. I think we still have more to do there to bridge that gap. So that's it, Cian. That's basically my presentation. Happy to take questions anyone might have.
That's brilliant, Brendan. It looked like such a really comprehensive study. Went into full of all the environmental effects and the different departments in the organization too who were part of this study. I just wondered, just thinking there is, would you have a comment on, how broad is the application or the implementation of this, do you feel, and what's the scope or limitations to it as well?
For farmers, is it? And
for farmers across the country, yeah.
Yeah. At this stage, it's a minority of farmers who have an interest in putting in, or certainly based on the use of them and the levels of them on farms. It's still a minority of farmers that are considering them. I think it applies to dairy, to beef, to sheep. It's not just dairy, So I think the main thing there is there's two aspects to that. Number one is the confidence among farmers to make the change. We're talking about a considerable investment here. It's, our costs of reseeding are traditionally we're around 400 euros. Certainly this year, from quotes that are there now, we're talking about 500 plus euros per acre to reseed a grazing pasture. So it's a big investment. And farmers they want to be sure-footed in terms of the changes they make. So I think showing the evidence, building that evidence base, longer-term studies, showing the benefits of this in the longer term, out to 5 to 10 years, I think will build the confidence of farmers to make those kinds of changes. And who doesn't want extra animal performance, higher intakes of animals, and so on? So I think it's broadly relevant, but at the same time, a minority have made the step change at this point, right? So And I think the second aspect of that then is, and this is based on international experience, the uptake of this kind of more diverse pastures and so on will have to dovetail with policy in terms of, that those farmers that are brave enough to take it on and to, in the same way as I guess acres and other schemes we're building in more diversity into swards and other ways. Farmers that do take those steps are acknowledged for the benefits that they're providing by uptaking those. So there's probably a two parts to that to see that become a bigger scheme in the future.
Look, we use discussion groups and kind of that peer learning an awful lot, and it is a hugely impactful way of trying to get practice change and habit change. Is what is the feedback in your experience from farmers who put it in? Do you know what how?
Yeah,
it's going to vary, but yeah.
Yeah, mixed. Like everyone is different. Personality types are different. You've got some that will jump in straight away. They'll just go for it. And others then will be more cautious. They'll wait longer and they want to see more and so on. So that's the difference. But look, the experiences is varied. I think some of that is like, I suppose, look, there's no things that have definitely bothered farmers. The initial adopters, let's call them, have been things like you're not using post-emergent sprays. So there's no post-emergent spray with herbs. So therefore, weed burdens, making sure that you have reduced and eliminated to a large extent as possible big weed populations from these swards well in advance of attempting to put in these new swards is very, very important. And in some cases, farmers have been bothered by weed burden and so on. So that's at one level. I definitely think the more general issue would be that the persistency of plants like chicory and red clover, it doesn't really matter that you say it, that they don't persist that well under grazing. Nonetheless, if you're paying for seed to put into a sward, you expect these plants to survive. So there's an underwhelming kind of, if they're disappearing in 12 or 18 months. But I think beyond that, I don't really foresee big differences. They're clover-based swards, and having high clover contents is it's more than half the journey, I guess, to reducing nitrogen use and so on. So from that aspect, I don't see them being particularly different to grass clover swards in terms of the importance of them and the development of them for the future. And then it's a question of, well, these herbs, can we include more of these herbs and is there a benefit? And I think certainly there's a huge amount of evidence showing plantain, in particular in dairy swards, would be a huge addition on top of that. And in other types of swards and other enterprises, maybe we can go further and do more,
Yeah, brilliant. I'm conscious the questions are absolutely raining in here, so I'll move to Oisin. Yeah, the questions are flowing there.
There's a lot of them, and that's a lot of compliments on your presentation there, Brendan. Genuinely, it makes it hard to get through them. There's so many compliments, as you can see. So look, just some to try and categorize the questions that are coming in. The board absolutely lit up there when you showed the information from your lysimeters or suction cups on the treatments, as you probably would have expected. Look, there's just to try and shorten up the questions there a bit into one. I suppose, look, do you expect that the losses for the entire year would be similar? If you were able to give that information, what would you attribute for the reason there is such high variation? From those, and is there basically why do you think there is such lower losses from multi-species swards?
Okay, so the full year, so what we will do, and we haven't done yet, is aggregate the nitrate leaching concentrations with the volumes that are moving through the soils at various points through the year. And we will, we'll come with cumulative values for the total drainage season for nitrogen in terms of in concentration, but also in terms of kilos of N leached. Okay, so if, for example, 2 to 4 milligrams of nitrate leaching if the average concentration was 2 to 4 milligrams of nitrate leaching, if that differential was maintained when we do the final analysis over a 500 milliliter drainage during autumn, that's the equivalent of between 10 and 20 kilos of N per hectare difference in nitrate leaching over the full year. So it is quite a substantial difference in terms of total nitrogen leaching. Okay, now we have to confirm that, and then that's what we will be doing over the next months once we have all of the data in. But nonetheless, it's quite a big number. There is no nitrate leaching outside of the period that I've shown because the soils water is moving upwards rather than downwards. So we're confident we're capturing all of the nitrate that's moving down here between October and, with the exceptions of a very wet summer or something, you might get more nitrate leaching. But for the most part, it's all happening between late September and, end of April. So that's the full year picture, I think. In terms of the reasons for the variation, unfortunately, in terms of farm systems, it's hard to disaggregate the impacts. You've reduced the chemical nitrogen application rate, which is obviously beneficial in terms of reducing the amount of nitrogen that's in those soils, then that rinses out of those soils and so on. So at one level, there's that aspect. But certainly in terms of the wider evidence, we've got lots of evidence now across Teagasc and other agencies that having plantain in swards is beneficial in terms of reducing nitrate leaching. And there's about 4 or 5 different kind of sub-mechanisms that are contributing to that. So in terms of, it tends to put more nitrogen. It's diluting the urine as the animal is taking in more water and the urine is more dilute. Urine is more spread out on the paddocks. The urine patch is a big feature here in terms of nitrate leaching because it's a big load of nitrogen going out. In particular, in the autumn, if you're putting more nitrogen into dung fraction, as appears to be the case with those plantain-based swards, that's a bit more stable and it breaks down more slowly, so it's less likely to be released. And there's also potentially denitrification effects in terms of having swards with this plantain in it. So it's not a very satisfactory solution or answer, Oisin, but there is a myriad of small factors contributing to why having plantain in these grass clover swards is contributing to reductions in nitrate leaching. But nonetheless, all the evidence points to having that there is giving us substantial benefits in terms of reducing nitrate leaching. So I guess we're seeing the result without being able to explain the subcomponent parts of it, I guess is what I'm saying there. I think the soil type is also very important. Obviously, if this trial was done in a heavier clay soil, it's important to say that the nitrate risk would be very low. There would be low levels of water moving down soils. This wouldn't be the same issue. In this site, we're increasingly facing dry summers where nitrogen is immobilized. There's not enough growth and there's no water movement. We're getting re-wetting of these soils in the early autumn, extra soil mineralization, and then there's a lot of nitrogen becoming available in the back end of the year and a lot of rainfall. Our winter rainfall then has picked up. We're getting more rainfall during autumn and winter. So the rinse effect there's a couple of moving parts that are kind of resulting in this effect that we're seeing. Very long-winded answer, sorry.
No, that's good. It was a complex question. Look, there was another category of questions there came in relation to persistency and on the different treatments. Just did you have to routinely oversow either the perennial ryegrass, water, or white clover, plantain, or chicory, and any weed problems in those treatments, and just on organic application of fertilizer as well to the different treatments, whether slurry or soil water.
Yeah. So look, we're trying to be as even-handed as possible across the different management systems. So rather than do nothing and wait for what we knew to be a reduction in persistency or the availability of these plants, what we did was each year, the grass clover and the multi-species swards, the worst 3 blocks, so the worst 15% of the area was oversown in April and May with clovers in the case of the grass clover and clovers and herbs in the case of the multi-species swards. So that was kind of like a management strategy. We said we'd start as a system where that's just what we're going to do. The effectiveness of that it remains to be seen. I'd like to see more work on that to see the oversowing method versus, it's hard to say whether that worked, but it does help to build contents over time, So we were doing that. In terms of the second part of your question was, sorry, no, I forgot again. The slurry. Yeah. So slurry so if we apply slurry to any paddock, we will apply it to all paddocks in the block. So yes. So when I talk about 250 kilos of N, that's the chemical nitrogen application to perennial ryegrass, and 125 was the chemical nitrogen application to grass clover and multi-species. In each case, those swards would have been supplemented with about another 20 kilos of organic N over the year. And they were done block by block evenly over time, so that I'm not counting it in terms of the N inputs, but I see that more as recycling than in addition, because it's the animals from the winter that we're putting back out those slurries. But it is even; it's identical between systems.
Yeah, and I suppose as a add on to that, there was just another question there as well in relation to were the tree treatments self-sufficient for winter feed, which is, I suppose, part of that.
No, and that's, we costed that in terms of the economic analysis. So I showed there, on average over the first 3 years, we were 13 tons of dry matter. And during that period, we actually had an overall stocking rate of 2.5. So we had a deficit of winter feed of order of magnitude of around 600 kilos per cow. And so that's why we built in the extra silage purchase costs into that. Now, in some years, that even became much more serious, that, in the latter years of the study, which are not part of the publication, like 2024, 2025 and 2026, or 2025 and 2024 have been poor grass growing summers. Our average grass growth production across these treatments has dropped under 12 tons of dry matter, 11 tons last year. It was even less than 11 tons last year. So in that situation, we're buying in silages and we're costing that in. So, but that's a year by year thing. It depends on how dry the summer is, I guess, and how much silage you can make.
It's probably going for the next publication, but is there any of the tree treatments more impacted by drought?
No, and a little bit of a disappointment. I guess looking at some of the evidence internationally, like there's fantastic work done in Johnstown, and in other John Finn has done massive work on this, showing the benefits of more diverse pastures in terms of drought tolerance, and during summer that plants will continue to grow at a higher level by having more diversity. And that's mirrored in data in Northern Ireland, mainland Europe and elsewhere. And that's why these swards are probably more common in those places. But we didn't see that. I can't say that, even though we've had tough summers during the study, like when we get into really dry summers where we're getting down into, 40, 50 mils of soil moisture deficits during summer, where our growth is dropping to 10, 15, 20 kilos. It's dropping in all treatments. So we didn't get a benefit from the more diversity in that. Now, maybe we just don't have enough diversity. I'm not sure. But it was, I suppose these grazing systems, your biomass levels aren't as high as in cutting systems. You don't have big crops of silage there. So the evapotranspiration is going to be higher. You're talking about 8 centimeters of biomass falling. You're managing it at a very low level of biomass anyway. And maybe in that regard, the way we're managing them, we're not able to see these benefits. But it's certainly one of the things I was anticipating that we didn't see.
Brendan, we had Paul Moore from Ed Éireann on last week, and you could see the very defined weather patterns that were last year. Particularly, let's say, the very wet autumn. We just had a change entirely from the summer into the autumn. And one of the questions here is just, are some of them, we're getting these more intense rainfall events, and just is the grazing platform then, or these types of swards, or how do they vary with regard to that tendency to poach or resistance, a trafficability, let's say?
Yeah. So we're definitely getting a lot more. Like we're only getting 10% of our rainfall now at this site. We're getting 10% of our rainfall during our meteorological spring and 10% during our meteorological summer. We're getting 40% during our autumn and winter, right? And that was 20%, 20, 30 and 30 historically. So we're getting more winter rainfall. Does it impact the different sward types in any great detail? Not from my mind. I mean, to be honest with you, we're doing a lot more on-off grazing across all of these sward types now. It's just not conscionable to leave animals out, for long periods when you're getting high rainfall patterns. So have we been able to do that to a greater or lesser extent with different sward types? I can't say we've tried. We tend to be, when we've got soil saturation animals are getting 3 hours of access and back into the shed as quickly as possible to try and minimize soil damage, soil structure, and so on. So there has been no difference in terms, I guess, another way of answering that question, there's no difference in terms of the length of the grazing season or the number of grazings we've gotten over the season between the different sward types. Probably though, the grass-only swards will be more dense. They'll be less open at the base and so on. So I guess you could look at that, but I haven't seen it as regarded at a system level anyway.
That's great. I can see, look, we'll keep going because the questions are just absolutely flogging in here. Back to you, Oisin, again.
Yeah, I was thinking to say, look, I suppose it just I kind of follow on there to one of your answers in relation to persistency. I think it's a good question. Just on grazability of multi-species sward, basically there's a couple of comments, and it seems to be that there's a big appetite to introduce this into further swards across farms across Ireland, but just some of the issues that are coming up are that it's not that it has been seen in some areas not to be standing up to grazing, delicate to poaching, and just is that your experience, Brendan? And anything on bloat issues, any evidence of that from what you've seen? And just and in light of that, just do you see it as actually be able to fit into how we graze, and can the uptake of it be, I suppose, higher than it is just because of its potential there, from what you showed?
Yeah, I think all new swards, you're very careful with them with grazing, that you're going to do damage and poach them and so on after putting the investment in. So we're always very sensitive to that. Is there a difference between the more diverse pastures and the grass only or the grass clover swards? I don't think so, personally, in that regard. Okay. In terms of what was the other part of that, Oisin? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no problem. Just, I suppose, just on how delicate it can be, and multi-species sward, particularly any issues with bloat and just grazability in general.
Yeah, so bloat, no. But then again, we haven't had the clover contents that we would have liked in both the grass clover and multi-species sward. So we've lost no animals with bloat, mercifully. We do use prevention, so bloat oil is in there. When we have high clover contents, and we are careful around grazing, that animals aren't going from very restricted to very big access to new clover swards. The animals, though, are on these swards all the time, and I think that's relevant to both the bloat question and also to the other question around palatability. That we have approximately 50 animals on a grass clover sward all the time, and they're adjusted to it. I think, they're not going into grass only swards and then back into grass clover swards and this kind of thing. So that's not such a problem. In terms of the palatability of the more diverse pastures, we've had no effect. If anything, in doing the trial, the problem was that the culture is to graze tight and to remove all the material. And to do that with the more diverse pastures, you're probably grazing a little too tight, if anything. It's our post-grazing residual target was 4, and numerically, it actually was slightly be under 4 with those swards rather than over 4. So that was kind of they're very easy to graze. And we had no refusals of plants or anything like that. They weren't going in and sub-selecting plants out of the swards. They took it all. Now, that said, I know certainly farmer experience has been that you put in a new multi-species sward, you're taking animals into this new sward, and they're going like, what are these plants? And there is an element of kind of getting used to them and so on. But I think that's an issue surely for a new sward if you have plantain in one paddock and nowhere else. But I think over time animals adjust, and to me, I think if you were seeding and over sowing them in, and you had them in a lot of the swards on the farm, you wouldn't even notice this anymore. The residuals. Groups visiting, I always show them, if you look at the residuals, you can't tell a grass clover, grass only, or multi-species sward from the residuals because all the plants have been removed.
Okay, very good. There actually, you mentioned that there as well. There has been a number of questions on the viability of oversowing it in rather than going to the full cost of reseeding. Maybe you've already.
Yeah. To be honest, I think it's an area we should do more work on, and probably do it on commercial farms as well. I think that, so if you think about the hesitancies that a farmer might have was, I have a weed burden on the farm, and therefore, do I have a lot of weeds after putting in a new sward and not using post-emergence spray? Well, if there is a big weed burden, in particular docks, then you are guaranteed to have a lot of docks in these new swards, and nobody wants that. Okay, so I think if it's we were I guess I was fortunate that the site we're using had almost no weeds, no docks in it before we started. And so there was very few docks in it afterwards as well. In fact, the biggest problem we had was probably a few thistles showing up in these new swards that we could spot spray, and that really solved our problem. But if we're a case for a farmer who was more nervous about the weed burden issue and had a history of weed burden on the farm, I think putting in a new grass clover sward, doing the post-emergence, making sure that you've got the weeds under control, and then introducing the plantains if it's a dairy farm on top of that, I think would be a really interesting way of doing it. I think the dry farms during summer probably will do better doing that than maybe other farms. But then again, they're the ones we really need to see these reductions in nitrogen leaching from. So look, that might be an advantage to this dry summer effect, that it gives these new plants an opportunity. We don't have enough evidence to show it, but if I look at New Zealand, where they have been oversowing swards with plantain and so on, they seem quite happy that they can do it by oversowing rather than reseeding.
Very good. No, thanks, Brendan. That's very well answered. Just on light of that, I suppose, look, because you use the same methodology to establish all swards. Is there any reasons that jump out at you for the big variation in clover content across the paddocks from 3 to about 30%? And then other questions on soil fertility, and I think they probably might relate to each other.
Yeah. So it's the go-to one when you don't have clover was the soil fertility adequate? And we each year we soil test all of the blocks. So there's like 3 treatments with 20 blocks. So that's 60 paddocks that are sampled every winter. And our P index across all of those blocks is we're index 4 for P, and we're high index 3 for K. The pH of the site is touching 7. So it's at a macro level, we're perfect in as much as we can say that. We've also done the micro elements. So we've done all the minor elements on each of those paddocks a couple of times. It's quite expensive to do, but we've done it. And there's none, like boron, all these trace elements and so on. There's nothing standing out to us that there's any kind of a mineral inhibition of the growth of these plants. We have more or less perfect soil fertility. Why are we getting such variation? Some of it is a system effect that, you still want to carry grass during winter and so on. You're building up covers in the autumn that you want to have for spring and so on. That probably lends itself to differences in clover content anyway between swards. We are grazing for a long season. We graze tight. Probably that influences the components of herbs anyway, certainly in the sward considerably. We're grazing late in the autumn. There's probably some treading damage, for plants by having that we're really pushing the envelope in terms of some of these plants and so on. So there's probably, I can't put my finger on one thing. I'd love to say I had a solution to why that variability is there. And I think there's an element of it too, is the choice of varieties and so on. And certainly the evidence in terms of the plant breeding trials that are done here and in Moorpark and elsewhere, showing that there is quite a variation in terms of the persistency of different clovers and so on. So that probably lends itself to, as we identify better clovers and more clovers that are more persistent in our swards, that'll help all of these treatments, not just the grass clover treatments.
Very good. Thanks, Brendan. I suppose just another couple of questions here to throw at you, if that's okay. So just on it, would you consider adding to the trial a zero chemical in treatment? And just, I suppose, maybe related to that in some way, how do you ensure that the greenhouse gas benefits are captured and the farmers get recognition for this?
So at the moment, would we put in a 0N treatment? I can't say I would, because our clover contents aren't. And now look, there's chicken and egg there in terms of that, but we're nowhere near the kind of clover contents that would support a zero nitrogen system at this site.
Well, Brendan, Can it just even because in Moorpark is quite and a lot of dairy farms at that high end is that if we wanted to roll this out, and there's a question for here from a internal in Teagasc about maybe there should be demonstrations done around the country, demonstration sites. Is how might you adapt them, or how do you feel for the lower fertilizer rates? Maybe I see the question was about zero, but there'll be a lot of farms that will be using substantially lower levels of fertilizer.
Yeah. So yeah. I suppose if like I think if you can establish. So are we talking about sheep and beef systems more, Cian, than we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. Just across the whole, not just sheep and beef, but anywhere across different
a more extensive
levels,
system.
let's say.
Yeah. Like where does less demand, like feed is probably the biggest single cost on these dairy farms now. It's estimated that about 42% of all costs on dairy farms relate to the production of feed, silage, fertilizer, contracting. It's all in there to produce feed, and fertilizer is roughly 4 cents a litre. It's a big cost. Okay, so I'd love to be able to take it down, but if we reduce the chemical fertilizer use levels in spring, in particular, when clovers aren't particularly active in these swards, we're getting more winter rainfall, it's colder soils and so on. I don't think that we will get the feed quantities that we need, unless we have, like, there is examples where we've had very high clover contents, and where you have very high clover contents, the response to extra chemical nitrogen is very, very poor. So, like, I think that's kind of a judgment one, and it nearly comes down to paddocks, doesn't it? It's not going to be whole farms. It's going to be where you've got very, very strong clover contents coming through from April, May, and that's in our recommendations now. For all farmers, that if you can look at your clover contents in April and May, and you find that in April you've got 20% clover in the sward, sure. I mean, our recommendations are in that setting. That's going to be a 30% clover content paddock for the year, and 50 kilos of chemical N might be adequate for that system because there's so much biological nitrogen fixation there. So I don't want to be too hard and fast in terms of prescriptive rules, but I do think paddock by paddock, where you've got higher clover contents, yes, you could go very low on the chemical nitrogen applications. And we see farmers doing that already. They'll use almost no chemical nitrogen, and they'll use slurries and stuff to meet the nitrogen requirements. So that's very much possible. But at whole farm level, I think we're quite far away from that, that there's enough clovers across all the paddocks on the farm to justify in the dairy setting. If the requirements for feed were less, where you had a more extensive system, then surely, you wouldn't need to use these kind of chemical nitrogen levels. And that would certainly be an additional benefit in terms of end surpluses and end losses and so on.
Just before you come back in there, Oisin, just related, there are a number of questions here with regard to nitrous oxide. And was there any measurement, or have you any comment on that with regard to the trial?
Yeah, we didn't measure it in the trial. We thought about it at stages, but looking at and speaking with colleagues, like you're trying to measure nitrous oxide variation inside in a system. It's an uncontrollable system, where a urine patch falls versus where a urine patch doesn't fall, and all of the complexity of that, and the the picking up of that nitrous oxide immediately after the grazing event versus over 3 or 4 days later, and so on. So there are certain things that I think aren't suited to systems evaluations, and I think nitrous oxide emissions at that level is one of those. That said, obviously we can model the systems. We've got a good way of doing that. The reductions in fertilizer obviously contribute to reduced nitrous oxide emissions and so on. So I think we can get a good handle on what the reductions in nitrous oxide emissions can be by looking at the savings in fertilizers, and also the more controlled trials that I've looked at, including plantains and such in swards and animal diets, and making best estimates from there. We didn't do it, and I'm not regretting that we didn't do it, because I'm not sure we could measure it with the level of detail that would give us results we can stand over in this kind of a setting.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Brendan. Back to you, Oisin. We'll try and get a few more in before we finish.
Yeah, apologies. There's plenty of them coming in there. I suppose just in relation to your overwinter covers, did you have to be particularly careful with with those on multi-species swards and white clover? And did you find that it impacted the content of both the following year?
So it adds to the variability. We weren't doing anything different between the sward types. We were closing off with farm covers of about 700 in the autumn and trying to open up in 1st of February at calving with about 900. So we've done trials before where we've opened up with farm covers of 1,000 and more on the pastures, and with paddocks on the farms with very high pre-grazing yields, we avoided that. Okay, so we weren't carrying very high biomass through winter because we know that definitely is antagonistic to clover contents in all of these sward types. But that said, we were still building grass for spring, and I think that's part of our system to have adequate grass in place at the start of calving, because that's our cheapest feed source. So we continue to do that, and I think that farmers wouldn't want us to deviate from that because that's still the primary feed source. And really, when you're testing these swards and so on, they need to fit with the system that we want, So we weren't prepared to reduce the overall calving farm cover very much in order to try and promote more clovers and herbs, I guess.
Thanks, Brendan. I'll just go back to you for a moment. Cian there, and questions. I must look through these here again.
Yeah, that's no problem. Look, there are lots there. Just a couple of questions there around maybe the finances again, and when the economics were done on it, and given where the world has moved, or the uncertainty for, certainly the short-term future, and we'll see about that, do you feel that the economics would have changed given where fertilizer prices have moved to?
Yeah, so I don't think any of us can foresee what's happening, to be honest. But the economic analysis was actually undertaken last year, so it was only published in January this year. So it's pretty real time in terms of milk prices. Chemical nitrogen price was around 186 a kilo of N, which is not that far off where it is today. Now, it may track up. It looks like it's going to go up with border tax adjustments and so on from there. So look, anything that drives up the fertilizer price is obviously going to be more advantageous to these legume-based swards long term. But equally, feed prices are going up, and costs of buying feed is also going up, contractor related and purchase of feed. So, I mean, if you're not self-sufficient, you're not growing enough feed, that cost is a big cost as well. So am I happy or sad that we're accurate on the numbers? I think that what's changing is changing pretty evenly for all those systems. Milk price is as it is today. It's around €6 a kilo milk solids was roughly the values we were using. So that's more or less where it's at today. But who's to say where those values are going to go? And I do think the other thing, we used receding costs and charges that were relevant at the end of 2025. Those have certainly gone up, and those probably will work against more frequent receding and so on. So that's definitely one to watch.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Willie. I think we'll try and get one more. Have you got one, Oisin, there?
Sorry, just to come back to trying to credit farmers with when they do uptake these measures, is there anything we can do in relation to that, Brendan, from what you've seen?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a bit outside my
Okay.
I think, the experience in terms of the various schemes that have been there. I think we'd probably have to learn from those in terms of what's the simplest way to do that? Is it seed sales, or is it visual determination of plants, or what? I'm not sure. But I think we have to acknowledge that those who put in, I think the best we'll probably do in the short term, logistically, is farmers who are prepared to include those plants in swards should be acknowledged for their efforts to do it, and benefit from that, because the evidence base is that they are doing something that will reduce nitrogen losses. To the extent of those reductions and the benefit that they may gain from it, it remains to be seen. I think we'll have to we have more to do to try and quantify what could that be in a farm setting. So I can't answer that question very well, Oisin, I'm afraid.
I know that's good.
Look, I'm conscious of the time, and I'd say if we were here for another hour, we could probably keep going on certain questions. And my thanks to Oisin, because I can see he amalgamated a huge number of questions that came in this morning. And just from my own personal point of view, is I coordinate the Teagasc Connected program, which tries to get this type of knowledge and research out to professionals in the sector. So, like, if you feel that this particular area or other areas may be of use to you or people like you in the industry, please let us know. You can get us through the Connected website or connected@teagasc.ie, and we will always endeavour to try and put on, additional technical updates or training sessions with regard to this type of material. My thanks to Brendan today for a great presentation. Thanks to Oisin for a difficult job, particularly given the number of questions that come in. To everyone for attending, and of course to the team in the background who have put this together. Next week we will have Anne Goggin on, and she will be discussing the Waters of Life EIP. We hope you'll be able to join us. Thanks a million to everybody. Talk to you next week.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.